The fog along Detroit's east side was still hanging low when the first hint of daylight touched the roofs on St. Aubin Street. It was early enough that most homes were silent, their curtains still drawn and their porches empty. Inside the Franklin house, however, the morning had already begun. Louise Franklin moved through the narrow kitchen with soft footsteps, careful not to wake the neighbors with any noise. She warmed yesterday's biscuits, set out the tin of coffee, and glanced toward the staircase where she expected her son's footsteps at any moment. Her husband, David, sat at the table rubbing his hands together, working the stiffness from a long week on the line at the plant. He still had boots to lace and a thermos to fill before heading out for his shift. Upstairs, 15-year-old Nathan called down to ask where his books had been moved the night before. Everything about the moment felt as routine as any other weekday morning. Then came the first knock, hard, abrupt, and entirely out of rhythm with the peaceful start of their day. Louise froze near the stove. David lifted his head, confused by the sound. The sun wasn't even up. Church friends wouldn't visit at that hour, neither would neighbors. The knock came again, louder, more forceful, as if someone meant to break the door down instead of waiting to be let in. David stood slowly, aware of how fragile peace in the city had become. Detroit had been tense for months, weighed down by job competition, resentment, and rumors that never stopped spreading. He unlatched the door only an inch before it was shoved open with enough force to throw him backward. 3 white men pushed into the living room with coats heavy enough to hide anything and faces that didn't show hesitation. No badges, no uniforms, no explanation. Louise gasped and stepped back, instinctively shielding the kitchen doorway. One of the intruders grabbed David by the front of his shirt and slammed him toward the wall. Another asked a question in a hurried voice Louise couldn't even make sense of. They moved with purpose, not the sloppy chaos of burglars, but the cold precision of men who already knew exactly what they planned to do. Nathan appeared halfway down the staircase, still adjusting his shirt, completely unprepared for what he was seeing. His mother screamed for him to run, but the first gunshot fired before he made it down the last step. The sound cracked through the tiny home and echoed up the staircase. Nathan clutched his chest and fell backward, sliding down a few steps before coming to rest on the landing. Louise rushed toward him out of instinct, more than thought, and the second gunshot struck her before she reached him. David lunged toward the intruder holding him, slamming both of them into the kitchen table hard enough to knock over a chair. For a fraction of a second, it looked like he might break free, but the third man raised his gun and shot him at close range. David collapsed beside the overturned chair, his boots still untied on the floor. In less than a minute, the men walked out as calmly as they had entered. No stolen money, no ransacked drawers, no explanation. They climbed into a dark sedan idling at the curb, and the driver pulled away into the fog without hesitation or urgency. Neighbors stepped onto porches seconds later, drawn by the echo of gunfire. Curtains shifted. A few whispered to each other across yards, unsure whether to approach or to stay inside. A patrolman driving through the area saw the sedan speeding off and followed the noise back to the Franklin house, arriving before anyone else worked up the nerve to check what had happened. He stepped inside and found Louise and Nathan on the stairs, and David barely alive on the kitchen floor. The officer tried to get a name or a description from him, but David's throat filled with blood before he could speak. He died within minutes. By the time the sun rose fully over the rooftops, the story had already begun to warp. People who had seen only shadows insisted they recognized unfamiliar voices. A reporter arrived with a notepad and a headline already forming in his mind, one that didn't match anything the neighbors believed. Detroit was an uneasy city in 1929. Fear spread faster than facts. It didn't take long before rumors of organized racial violence filled the morning papers, even though the victims were a quiet black family with no known enemies, and the attackers had been clearly white. Police leadership, responding to both political pressure and public fear, launched what they described as a citywide sweep. What happened next stretched far beyond anything the Franklin family had endured. Officers stormed through black neighborhoods on the east side, dragging men and teenage boys from their beds and off porches without warrants or explanations. Some were still in their nightclothes. Some were on their way to work. Mothers begged for answers as their sons were pushed into police cars. It didn't matter that none of them matched the intruders described by the neighbors. It didn't matter that no evidence pointed toward them. The goal was to restore confidence, not find the truth. More than 100 black men were taken into custody that day. At precincts across the city, basement rooms filled with frightened faces as detectives interrogated them around the clock. Many had never heard of the crime until they were accused of it. Some were beaten. Some were held for days without charges. Officers claimed they were searching for leads, but they were chasing shadows because they had ignored the only clear description anyone had offered. The killers had been white. In the Franklin neighborhood, grief and anger grew in equal measure. Friends stood outside the home in disbelief, talking in low voices about how the police seemed more interested in rounding up the closest black men than in finding the three who had actually committed the murders. Some neighbors tried speaking to reporters to correct the narrative, but their statements were buried under sensational headlines that stirred fear instead of facts. Within a week, most of the arrested men were released. None had been connected to the massacre. None had been charged. Detectives quietly admitted they had no leads. The case files began to gather dust even before the funerals were held. The city moved on faster than the neighborhood did, shifting its attention to other crises. But on St. Aubin Street, the memory stayed raw. People still remembered the sound of those gunshots, the rush of police cars, and the feeling that their entire community had been blamed for the murder of a family they loved. The attackers were never found. Their names never appeared in any report. Their car was never traced. They slipped into the fog that morning and disappeared forever, protected by silence, fear, and a system that never looked in their direction. St. Aubin Street eventually returned to its routine, but the house where the Franklins died carried an emptiness no amount of fresh paint or new tenants could erase. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.